It's my pleasure to welcome back to our pulpit this Sunday Josh Ashley. Since Josh and his family joined UUFBC in September of 2009, Josh has supported our fellowship in many different leadership roles. These include second hour facilitator, worship service leader, and past UUFBC board president, just to mention a few. He and his wife, Elizabeth, are the parents of Xander and Olivia, both youth members of our RE programs and chalice lighters on occasion. Josh, welcome.
Thank you, Shar. Good morning, everyone. Thanks. I don't come up here all that often. It's been a couple years since I last came up here and did one of these perspectives, sermons, whatever it is we want to call what happens in front of this podium. My friend Denny Lauer has said before that everyone has at least one good sermon in them, and if we're lucky, maybe we can squeeze out a few half-decent ones too. In the past, I've talked about some subjects like dealing with generational trauma and abuse, or how algorithmic social media has changed how we relate to one another as people. Today, I want to talk about something a little more sensitive, democracy and religion. Ooh, that's uncomfortable, isn't it? I kind of feel a little squirming out there. Mixing politics and religion, where are the lines? That's okay, it probably should be uncomfortable. And I know you're thinking, oh no, here we go, in election year, and we're going to hear some political rant that's going to come right up to the edge of what's permissible to say from the pulpit. But no, well, maybe a little of that, but that's not really why I'm up here. I'm up here because small d democracy is part of the fabric of our religious community. It's written into the principles that congregations agree to promote and affirm in how we relate to each other and the world. Specifically, our fifth principle says, we affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. And you know what the fun part about that is? The principles, they didn't come from a holy book. It wasn't handed down from God to a gray-bearded man on a mountain on golden tablets. Like all of our principles, that one, it was collaboratively written in a committee. It was debated on and voted on in a democratic process. It's still subject to change. In fact, there have been discussions ongoing for years now at the UUA on if we should adopt new frameworks in describing our religious perspectives. A lot of us, myself included, grew up in relatively authoritarian religious traditions in which many aspects of faith were rigid and unquestionable. But that's not the case here. Here, we elect all of our leaders. We make decisions using committees and boards. We vote on our budgets and on our ministers. That's because Unitarian Universalism is a free faith, administered by free people, in order to build a better, more just world, one heart at a time. And I think that gives us a unique and important perspective in how we approach the world. Because make no mistake, democracy and the rule of law are under threat everywhere we look. People openly talk now about ignoring election results and using the force of law to violate human rights. We live in a world that appears to be standing on the abyss. Schools have become hostile places where it feels like our kids are more likely to encounter weapons than books. Many elected officials have stated a desire to eliminate trans people from public life. War has returned to the fields of Europe as part of a naked power grab to snuff out democratic impulses in Ukraine. Now look, for the majority of the 2000s and 2010s, whenever people who watched too much news started doomsaying, I pointed to improving statistics like declining deaths from conflict, declining global poverty, improving life expectancy, and the growth of democracy leading to improved protections for human rights. But over the course of the past decade, all of those measures of human development have reversed. I hate to say it, but yes, it's true. We now live in a world where life has become objectively worse for the average person. In such times, it can be far too easy to fall to despair, to a sense of hopelessness. After all, what can we do about this? And individually, that's true. You can't fix the world, I can't fix the world. And trying to take on that burden will either lead to megalomania or terrible anxiety. But by standing with each other, we can take little steps here and there and build movements that can hold back the tides of authoritarianism. After all, there have been dark times before. Consider one of the darkest chapters imaginable in history, when millions of Jews and others were murdered in the Holocaust. Unitarians at that time were watching, and their faith called them to do something. Reverend Waitzel Sharp of Wellesley, Massachusetts, got together with some friends and colleagues and founded a little organization that you may have heard of, the Unitarian Service Committee. Working with Unitarian churches in Prague, in Lisbon, and across Europe, Reverend Sharp and the USC were able to distribute aid to thousands and evacuate hundreds of refugees. In fact, this is where the flaming chalice, a symbol of our faith, was born. A lot of people don't realize that. To most people, it's a pretty symbol we put on our walls, but it has a real history and it has meaning. It was originally drawn by an Austrian artist, Hans Deutsch, who in the 1930s made himself into an enemy of the Nazis after making unfavorable political cartoons of Adolf Hitler. After fleeing his home, he eventually began working with the Unitarian Service Committee. In Hans's words, "I am not what you may actually call a believer, but if your kind of life is a profession of your faith, as it is, I feel sure, then religion, ceasing to be magic and mysticism, becomes confession to practical philosophy, and what is more, to active, really useful social work. And this religion, with or without a name, is one to which even a godless fellow which myself can wholeheartedly say yes." And so the USC asked Hans to create a symbol for their papers to make them look official, to give dignity and importance to them, and at the same time to symbolize the spirit of our work. When a document may keep a man out of jail, give him standing with governments and police, it's important that it look important. In other words, it needed good branding, and I think that's pretty good branding. So with pencil and ink, he drew a chalice with a flame. The flaming chalice design was made into a seal for papers and a badge for agents moving refugees to freedom. In time, it became a symbol of Unitarian Universalism all around the world. So when you see the symbol behind me, just take a moment to remember what it originally stood for: a small light in the darkness, guiding refugees from genocide to safety. Jane Park gave a sermon a couple weeks back on her pilgrimage to Selma, Alabama. And this was another chapter in the history of Unitarian Universalists' fight, as many UUs joined hands and hearts with other civil rights protesters, many motivated by their own religious sense of justice and participatory democracy, in overturning the evils of segregation. This is one of our martyrs, Reverend Reeb, lost his life in that fight in 1965. Now look, I was born in Birmingham in the mid-1980s. I spent most of my childhood here in Northwest Florida. I would occasionally hear about these famous civil rights protests in the sanitized, idealized way that was taught in our schools in the 90s. But one of the things that was lost in that version was how local this movement was to us. Selma's just up the road from here. It's 165 miles from where I stand, less than a 3-hour drive. I've driven through it, in fact, multiple times, without giving that history much of a second thought. I think that because in building up these sanitized myths, we become a little unmoored from them, unable to relate or continue their legacy. That's why I found Jane's sermon to be so powerful. In highlighting the everyday people involved in the 1960s civil rights movement, she showed that it wasn't just legendary heroes, it was everyday heroes. Regular folk from these very places we live today, who felt that something just wasn't right about their community and were determined to do something about it. That's the very heart of democracy. Because contrary to some bold proclamations, history did not end when the Berlin Wall fell. We still live in an imperfect world, and we still have work to do. Maybe despite the proximity of Selma, the 1960s Alabama could still feel a little far away from where we sit today. So maybe we need some more modern examples. Okay, in 2004, a multi-faith coalition of Catholics, Jews, Presbyterians, and yes, Unitarian Universalists formed the advocacy group No More Deaths, dedicated to relieving the humanitarian crisis on our southern border. I'll read their mission statement. "We come together as communities of faith and people of conscience to express our indignation and sadness over the continued death of hundreds of migrants attempting to cross the U.S.-Mexico border every year. We believe that such death and suffering diminish us all. We share a faith and a moral imperative that transcends borders, celebrates the contributions immigrant peoples bring, and compels us to bring relationships that are grounded in justice and love. As religious leaders from numerous and diverse faith traditions, we set forth the following principles by which immigration policy is to be comprehensively reformed. We believe that using these principles, listed from the most imminent threat to life to the deepest systemic policy problems, will significantly reduce, if not eliminate, deaths in the desert borderlands. Since 2004, No More Deaths has called the public and lawmakers to consider immigration from not just a cold legal perspective, but also from a human perspective. In addition to their advocacy work, No More Deaths also participates in direct aid to migrants, leaving basic supplies like food, water, and clothing in high-risk areas of the Arizona desert. So there's the story of Scott Warren, his picture's behind me, a Unitarian Universalist in Arizona and a member of No More Deaths. Since 2013, he has been involved in direct aid mission of No More Deaths. In that time, he has found at least 16 bodies of people who lost their lives trying to cross the desert. He and his friends have been driven by their faith to do what they can to reduce this kind of suffering. And so, for years, he left water for the thirsty, food for the hungry, bandages for the hurt. They set up a small base to coordinate operations called the Barn, which became a temporary place of refuge for migrants. On January 17th, 2018, Border Patrol agents stormed the Barn while Warren was there, guns drawn, not even a warrant. What they found inside the barn shocked and horrified those stormtroopers. They found 2 tired, parched, starving migrants receiving basic care from Scott Warren. He was arrested and charged with multiple felonies for the crime of giving away food and water, with a potential sentence of 20 years in prison. When asked at trial to offer a defense for his work with No More Deaths, Warren simply said, "The mission I support is to end death and suffering in the Arizona, Sonora, Odom borderlands." A few months later, in dismissing some charges before even going to trial, the judge ruled the defendant was obliged to leave water jugs because of his religious beliefs, and the government's regulation imposes a substantial burden on his exercise of religion. In late 2019, the remaining charges, they made it to trial, and a jury found him not guilty. I think Scott Warren's case reminds us that we should not allow religious authoritarians to have a monopoly on what it means to exercise religious freedom. No More Deaths is a pluralistic organization with participation from a wide variety of faiths, including our own. It's well organized, hundreds of volunteers, training, and participatory decision-making. That should sound familiar. Think back to those mythic civil rights organizations from the 1960s we talked about earlier, or the Unitarians in the 1940s. It's the same thing. History has indeed not ended, and we have a right and responsibility to participate in processes that will shape the world that our children and grandchildren will grow up in. And I think we still have work to do. Within the past month, I've had longtime friends flee this state because it's no longer safe for trans people. I heard Lynn McMorrow's passionate warning just a few weeks ago that they're coming for her family. I've seen the language and the laws targeting trans people in our area get uglier and scarier. I don't have the answers on how we can fix this or other issues, but I know we must do our part to help. As one of my favorite theologians, Mr. Jon Stewart of Comedy Central said, "The work of making this world resemble one that you would prefer to live in, it's a lunch pail kind of job, day in and day out, where thousands of committed, anonymous, smart, and dedicated people bang on closed doors, pick up those who are fallen, and grind away on issues until they get a positive result. And even then, you have to stay on to make sure the result holds." So the good news is, you don't have to worry so much about who wins the election in November. I'm saying instead that you have to worry about every day before and every day after, forever. You might have thought I was joking when I called Jon Stewart a theologian, but we're Unitarian Universalists, which means we allow ourselves to find wisdom from any source. And I think that the sentiment that he expressed there is pretty sacred. Because democracy is not a system of governance, not really or exclusively, because I think it's best described as a verb. Yes, it includes voting, but also so much more. Democracy is marching for human rights. It's when UU ministers perform unions for LGBT people decades before it was legal. Democracy is leaving water in the desert for migrants under threat of imprisonment. Democracy is about affirming the humanity of our trans brothers and sisters and pulling back the curtain on censorship. And yes, democracy is imperfect. It's not guaranteed or the natural state of humanity. Over the course of thousands of years, there have only been a few examples of democratic societies. That's not due to a lack of imagination. Philosophers have long thought about democracy. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates used the analogy of a ship at sea. If you were to put a random group of people in a boat and ask them to elect a captain, they'd probably elect the most persuasive person who promised nice things. And then it would be a disaster and everyone would die. The point of that analogy is not to turn to dictatorship. It's that the passengers need to become knowledgeable and skilled crewmen if they are to have an informed and helpful voice in running the ship and deciding on its leadership. This is also true of running a church and running a country. Without an educated, active citizenry, democracy will wither. So yes, democracy is messy. It's endless committees, it's budget work, it's searching for a consensus on divisive issues. It's slow, and there will be constant pushback from people who desperately want to hold on to the power that their ancestors took generations ago. There will be setbacks, but it's worth doing because it's only together that we can build a better world, one committee at a time. And ultimately, democracy is an act of faith in each other and a common destiny. And so, I'll close where I began. We affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of democratic processes within our congregations and in society.